Hi, Dr. Karney. Thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure, Faye.
Thank you. So to start off, could you briefly introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Benjamin Karney, and I'm a professor of social psychology at UCLA.
Thank you. Um, so there are, I know that there are different sub-branches of psychology, each with its own appeal. So why did you choose social psychology to focus your research on? What makes it a unique inquiry for you?
Um, Social psychology is the psychology of everyday life. It's the psychology of being human. So when I discovered that there was a science of how people live every day on the planet Earth with other human beings, I realized that's for me. Social psychology is for me the kind of fundamental. It's a fundamental, systematic inquiry into what it means to be alive as a human being.
Yeah,
So I think it's super relevant. It's just relevant to everything that everyone does all the time.
hmm definitely. I think out of all the different branches of psychology, I think social psychology is probably the one that almost every individual can find like the most relevant to themselves, and also just there's something intuitive about it that just makes sense. So yeah, it's really cool
I
science.
think it's cool. Social psychology isn't always intuitive. Often it's counterintuitive and surprising, but it's counterintuitive and surprising about things we really want to know about.
Yeah,
So you don't have to convince someone that the questions that social psychology asks are relevant. Why do we obey authority, even if we know the authority is wrong? Why is it that sometimes we behave in ways that are inconsistent with our own values? Why do people harm each other, even though nobody thinks that that's a great thing to do? Why do people fall in love or out of love? Why do people decide to love the people that they love? Why do people like some things and dislike other things? Like, these are just such basic questions. The idea that there's a science devoted to answering them is very appealing.
yeah, definitely. Um, from the research that you've been conducting on, what would you say is something that comes as the most surprising to you?
Sure. Well, what I study is intimate relationships. So I
Mhm.
do most of my research on couples, as you know.
Right.
And I've studied couples for, I guess, almost 30 years now. And in that time, I've been surprised a number of times. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't recognize enough, that comes out in my research, is
Mhm.
that what goes on between two people in their relationship isn't only a function of those two people and their relationship. That factors outside of the couple, outside of the relationship, can affect what goes on inside the relationship. And we've seen that time and time again, that the way that two people love each other is affected by the other people they know, the other relationships they have. The way that two people deal with their private life when they're alone is affected by the stress they've experienced during the day before they ever see each other. Like, for me, those are those are non-intuitive findings that change the way you think about relationships, because you think, wow, relationships are something that two people, if you work hard enough, you can make it work.
Mhm.
That's not always true. Sometimes relationships can succeed or fail based on things that are totally outside the couple's control. And I think that's a message that isn't always appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of like the bigger picture of what relationships are undertaking. Yeah.
It just, I think, offers a broader perspective on the ways to understand relationships.
So I'm curious, throughout your years of research and just in your day-to-day life as a relationship scientist and social psychologist, what has been your favorite part about it, and what has been perhaps the most challenging part to it?
Well, my favorite part is interacting with students and colleagues. It's a great job to be a social psychologist
Mhm.
because, especially at a university, because
Right.
you're surrounded by other colleagues who are doing interesting work and asking interesting questions, and surrounded by students who are at the beginning of their careers, the beginning of their intellectual lives, also asking new questions. I've been teaching this class for 20 years, and every single time I teach it, students ask questions that they've never asked me before, that I've never even thought of before. So what I love about the job is it's always new, and it exposes me to new ideas and new ways of thinking. And that's a great way to get older. That's just wonderful and
Yeah.
exciting. The
Yeah.
challenge, the challenge of, well, you know what, another thing I love
Mhm.
about being in my job is I get to decide how I spend my time. If I have an interesting question, I get to pursue it, and I can decide how to spend my day and how to invest my efforts. And no one really tells me what to do. And that's a great position to be in, and I'm very grateful to be in it. So those are some of the great things about my job, and then there's many others I could tell you about. The challenge of the job is, I think, making sure that I have enough resources to do what I need to do. So I get a lot from the university, but the work is expensive. You know, if you're going to try to tackle a big problem, it takes big resources. Nobody cures cancer for free. Nobody solves global warming for free. These are problems that cost money. And a challenge is convincing people that the same level of resource investment is warranted by social psychological problems and even the problems I study of couples and intimacy. If we're really going to understand how to make love last, that requires resources. And that's often been a challenging argument to make to funding agencies. And having to get those resources every few years, that's a challenge. I'd rather not do that, but cry me a river. I shouldn't complain. It's still a very, very good job.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Thank you for the insights. So, um, would you say that let's so would you say that the most challenging part to it is kind of to make an argument um to others on why this matters?
Well, I don't really have to convince people that the phenomenon matters. If I say to people, I study couples and how they fall in and out of love, everyone's like, yeah, that matters. Like that's central to people's lives. You don't have to argue. Then
Right.
I say, and I think that making progress in answering this question will require tens of millions of dollars of federal investment. I'm like, oh, well, that's a different story. And that's the harder case to make. So it's not, people understand that the problem is significant in everyone's life.
Mhm.
It's quite another thing to say that solving the problem is going to take real resources.
Right.
Uh, that's a challenge.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, um, there are like so many, I'm sure there are just so many different interesting aspects about social psychology and intimate relationships to invest in, um, like your time, your resources. So, when you choose a topic to diving deeper to pursue it, um, what are usually some of the like how do you usually choose that? What makes some research topics stand out from others?
Great question. Um, for me, an interesting research question is a question that I don't obviously know the answer to,
Mhm.
and where the answer might change my way of thinking. The more that an answer to a question might change my way of thinking, the more exciting that question is.
Right.
So, for example, if you were going to do research on the effect of touch on feelings of closeness to your partner,
Mhm.
and you told me, hey, if couples cuddle more, they feel closer, I'm going to say that's not so exciting to me. I knew that was true. I expected that was true.
Right.
What would make that interesting is sometimes being close leads to closeness. Other times being close can be claustrophobic and irritable and irritating. Like,
Mhm.
yeah, that's true. Then you ask a question, which is, well, when does touch increase closeness and when is touch irritating? I'm like, well, actually now there's a tension. There's something to be resolved. Like, wait a minute, that's right. This closeness can sometimes be rewarding and sometimes be irritating. What makes the difference? I'd like to know that. So for me, a good question has a tension in it that
Mhm.
begs to be resolved. And those are the kind of questions I try to pursue.
I see. Would you say that these questions, they usually emerge from old research that other people have done, and then there's something in it that that is like a new angle to it that you would like to pursue? Or is it sometimes like that, or sometimes it's kind of like an idea that just
Okay. You're asking a question, which is where do research questions come from?
right?
And the answer is they come from lots of places. The best place that research questions come from is direct personal experience with the world.
Mm.
That's the best. For me, the most interesting questions are questions that come out of, I'm in the world and there's something I experience and that you experience that's mysterious, that I don't understand. So I'm going to study something that is part of our experience. For me, that's the best. That's number one, the best choice for research question. A question that answers an experience that we have. But it's not the only place research questions come from. Sometimes they come, as you were saying, from reading old research. So you can read old research and say, I wonder if that's still true. Maybe I'll find out. We can read old research and say, wow, they didn't have the same technologies that I have. I wonder if I use new technologies, will I get the same answers? Maybe I have reason to believe I'll get different answers, and I should probably document that. Another way you can read the old research is and this is a little bit more interesting for me, is reading the old research and saying, hey, there's people who disagree in existing research. That can be very exciting. Wait, some people are saying X, but other people are saying Y. If I can be the one to understand the difference, to understand, well, when is it X and when is it Y? And why did people say it was one thing versus another thing? If I can reconcile or integrate two lines of existing research, that's pretty great. Another thing I can do is say, here's a line of research, and here's an idea in a different line of research that's never been applied to this first line of research. What might I generate by crossing the streams, by integrating two lines of research that have not been integrated before? So there's lots of great ways you can generate research questions from existing research, and they're all great, but not quite as great as saying, I had an experience that I want to understand better.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Um, so I'm curious, since researching social psychology has been taking place for decades now, and when you study them, in what ways do you see that um, do you see that research in social psychology has affected and being affected by, I guess, development in things like technology, as well as just societal ideas in general?
It's a really good question, Faye. Clearly, social psychology has been affected by current events throughout its history.
Mm.
Whatever's in the news, social psychologists tend to study. When I was in graduate school, the AIDS crisis was really prevalent and actively in the news all the time. The headlines were about the terrible spread of the HIV virus.
Mhm.
And so social psychologists started studying, how do you get people to practice safer sex? why do people believe what they believe when about condom use and other kind of safer sex practices. Social psychology only took it on because the issues were in the news.
Right.
Social psychology has always been interested in studying racism and discrimination because those have always been in the news, and they unfortunately still in the news. The other question, so social psychology is, people study the effect of Facebook and internet communication on relationships because those things are happening in the world. So the world affects social psychology a lot.
Right.
The harder question is, has social psychology affected the world? Have social psychologists affected the way people think in the world? And the answer is not as much, but there are ways, lots of ways, that social psychologists have affected thinking. So, social psychologists have talked about the effect of sort of the difference between, social psychologists have talked a lot about how people choose their behaviors and talked about the difference between electing to do something versus electing not to do something. And it turns out that if there's a behavior we want you to do, like let's say invest in your retirement fund, it's harder for people to enact that behavior than it is to opt out of that behavior. What I mean by that is, if you want people to, if you say to people, check here to invest in your retirement fund, they won't. But if you say to people, check here to opt out of automatic investments in your retirement fund, they also won't. So if you want people to invest, say to everybody, you're automatically enrolled unless you opt out. And then many people won't opt out. So there's this behavioral inertia. That's one of many examples of real policies that are affected by social psychological research. Marketing, behavior, advertising is deeply affected by social psychological research on how people communicate and what changes people's attitudes. There's research on obedience. The Stanley Milgram's classic obedience experiments have inspired countless, not countless, but several different movies and popular culture ideas. Like, it's something that many, many people have heard of. So I do think that social psychology has affected the world and changed the world in positive ways, although social psychology has also been affected by the world in, even more deeply.
Right. To what extent do you think the limitation of how much social psychology can influence the world comes from? Is it just that, like, if there's something informative and important that social psychology, like research tells, why is it that there are times when people still don't follow what research suggests, or still doesn't pursue a policy aligning with that, even though they know it's like science has told this such and such?
Well, that's a very timely question, of course. And it's a question that the question you ask, which is, why is it hard for science to affect policy? It's timely because science right now hasn't affected policies in ways that might be life-threatening to lots of people. So when you ask, the question isn't why don't people listen to social psychologists? The question is, why don't people listen to scientists generally? There's many people in this country who refuse to take the COVID-19 vaccine.
Right.
There's many people in this country who deny that the world is getting warmer. So if you're an if you're an infectious disease specialist, it must be very frustrating to know that half the country is ignoring you. If you're a climate scientist, it must be very frustrating to know that the world, by and large, the governments of the world are ignoring you.
Right.
So when I think, oh, social psychology gets ignored sometimes by policymakers, I think, well, I'm in great company. Is that social psychology is the only field that also explains why people often don't pay attention. They don't pay attention because people often believe what they want to believe.
Mhm.
They look for answers that are consistent with their desired beliefs. So if I want to believe, if I'm afraid of vaccines for one reason, or I have a job that depends on something that makes the world warmer, and I'm highly motivated to doubt vaccines or doubt that there's global warming, social psychology articulates how people can find a way to support their own beliefs. People find other alternate paths to the truth. And now with the internet, and with the fact that, people say a lot of different things on the internet, it's possible to find support and social validation for almost any belief you should happen to have.
Yeah,
We
that's
know that when there's social validation for a belief, you tend to hold on to it, even if there's no scientific validation for that belief. So the phenomenon is broader than social psychology, but the explanation for the phenomenon is only social psychology.
yeah, that's so interesting to think about that. Um, I guess I'm curious, what have you seen on the internet? I guess that's something about social psychology that's really popular and believed by a lot of people, but there's like no scientific support for that whatsoever.
Well, a lot of times common beliefs, there's a grain of truth to them,
Mm.
but often there's nuance that is not appreciated by some people. So for example, many people believe in my field, no, let me put it this way. With respect to what I study,
Mhm.
many people who are not scientists believe that men and women are fundamentally different in relationships. That men, are more interested in sex and less interested in commitment, and women are less interested in sex and more interested in commitment, and that these are just biological differences between men and women. But if you actually look into the science of this, there's not a lot of support for those generalizations. They're stereotypes. There's a grain of support,
Mhm.
and that the stereotypes are endorsed by men and by women. So men and women agree that men are less likely to value commitment, and men and women agree that women are more likely to value commitment.
Mhm.
But the reasons for this are much more social than they are biological. There's lots of evidence that under the right circumstances, men are perfectly motivated to and care about commitment. Women's attitudes towards sex are highly dependent, not on their biology, but on their social circumstances. So the idea that there's some biological inherent differences in how men and women deal with intimacy isn't supported, although lots of people think it's true. But on the other hand, it is true that there's lots of social differences
Mhm.
and socialized differences between how men and women approach intimacy. But if we acknowledge that those are socialized differences, then there are differences that may well evolve as society evolves.
Right. Yeah, it definitely seems like, although it's still something that's being believed and talked about a lot now, I would say um, that it seems that back a long time ago, there's an even stronger belief in this like fundamental difference between men and women, and that gets reflected in the society and the societal culture they're in. And it's definitely interesting to see how um, sometimes like beliefs get reinforced but also change, and also just like change the culture that we're in. It's um so I guess my next question is more about studying and being a researcher throughout this time. I guess I'm just curious, was there ever a time when you felt like overwhelmed in your academic pursuit, and or you were like just hitting a roadblock of some sort, and if so, how did you overcome that?
Well, I got great advice from my mentor early on in my career. So this is my mentor and advisor, and still collaborator to this day, is Tom Bradbury, a clinical professor here at UCLA. And Tom said early on, you will encounter roadblocks. Like, you will have projects that don't pan out, that you'll invest a lot of time and money in, or time and effort in, and then there'll be an obstacle, or you won't know how to get forward over it, or it just won't pan out. And the way to deal with that, he said, is try to have several irons in the fire at once. What that means is, don't be working on only one project. If you have several different projects and one isn't panning out, well, then you have something constructive to do. Work on a different one.
Right.
And that's been very, very good advice, which I have found over the years since he's given that advice to me. It's panned out a lot. Like, oh no, this part isn't working out. Well, I'll work on something else. And then sometimes that really helps to go, when I return to the original project that wasn't panning out, I see it from a new angle, or I see a new solution. Or if I have to cut bait and say, well, that didn't, I'm going to abandon that project, that's okay, because I've got other things going on. So having multiple projects at once is a way of sort of avoiding that kind of crushing disappointment when one thing doesn't work, because lots of times things don't work.
Yeah.
But that's okay. There's other things that will work.
Yeah, that's a really smart strategy.
I have a really smart advisor.
Yeah. I'm curious, besides being a researcher in social psychology, what other roles typically do social psychologists take on? When you mention projects, does it usually do they usually refer to strictly like scientific research, or are there other tasks or positions that social psychologists take on, I guess, kind of more outside the science community?
Social psychologists are all over, increasingly all over. So for me, I'm a professor at a university. My projects are scientific research projects. But social psychologists are everywhere. There are social psychologists in government, at the Center for Disease Control, at the National Institutes of Health, at the National Science Foundation. All of those places employ social psychologists to do research, to ask questions. In the nonprofit world, there are nonprofit think tanks and policy analysis institutions that hire social psychologists. And increasingly in the technology world, a lot of PhDs from UCLA are now being hired away by Facebook, by Netflix, by Google, by Amazon, because a lot of what those tech companies are studying are social psychological questions. How do people make the choices that they make? Why do people have the preferences that they have? And social psychologists are well trained to ask and answer those questions. So there are different lives. They're different lifestyles, but this training of how to ask and answer questions about everyday life that social psychology provides qualifies people for a wide range of jobs.
Interesting. Yeah, I definitely didn't know that before, but that was very good to learn. And so you mentioned that there are like many different areas that social psychologists are active in. In what area do you see, like, in which of those areas do you see research in social psychology manifest the best as a way of advocacy and activism for people?
I don't think there's one way. I think social psychology has an important role to play in all of these domains. in education,
Mhm.
in increasingly social psychologists are being hired in business schools as well to study management and organizations and, again, decision-making behavior in a business setting. That's all applied social psychology as far as I'm concerned. You have social psychologists who are overlap with political science and are advising on political campaigns, advertising. I mean, I believe that social psychology is a fundamental science, and that it is fundamental, therefore, to lots of different domains of human activity.
Right.
I don't think one of them is better than the other. I don't think there's a better way to be a social psychologist. I just think everyone should be a social psychologist.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, that's very true. I feel it's
Yeah.
like it's like meaningful to both like the self and others. It's definitely a very good pursuit. Um, but um, I guess as we wrap up, I do have um a last few questions. And one of them is just you've you've studied and conducted research on interrelationships and social psychology for the entirety of your academic career. And but like you mentioned before, there are times when it can get frustrating or there are just something that doesn't pan out. Um, I guess what are some general advice you think people can benefit from in terms of maintaining that curiosity and motivation to continuously move forward and find different angles to dive into the problems or topics they really care about?
Well, I've been fortunate to have found a way into studying something that I'm genuinely curious about
Mm.
and that I see all around me and that's super relevant. So, and it's a phenomenon that is big enough that you can attack it from lots of different angles. I mean, I study intimacy in the context of marriage. Economists care, sociologists care, public health people care, social psychologists care, clinical psychologists care, developmental psychologists care, poets, playwrights, philosophers, everyone cares.
Right.
So it's not hard for me to stay interested because I'm always reading new things about it. I'm always hearing new people talk about it. And you can study it from there's so many questions you can ask about the phenomenon of human intimacy. There's so many questions to ask. It never gets boring and it never gets old. I think if your research question is motivated only by prior research on that question, then it can get old. Like, again, that's why I say that the research question that sustains the longest careers are research questions that are grounded in human experience. So, for example, a classical and incredibly influential early social psychologist was named Muzafer Sharif. And Sharif cared about war. He thought war was a total puzzle. And he wanted to understand. He spent his entire life trying to understand, why do people go to war? Why do groups go to war with each other? He never got bored with that question, because you never will get bored of that question, because it's an incredibly important question. And there's lots of different angles to it. So he found his way into studying a question that is deep, is broad, is relevant, is important. And if you've got a question like that, it's not as hard. It's easier to sustain interest in it. If you're studying something extremely narrow, you can also sustain interest, but I find that these big, deep, relevant questions are great ways to spend a lifetime.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for everything that you shared. I think that's all the questions I've got for the interview.
Thank you for interviewing me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you.